Hi, my name is Sarah Adkins, and for my research paper, I chose to look at the historical and cultural implications for women in Chopin's Story of an Hour. Women's rights are constantly evolving. It was only 100 years ago that the 19th Amendment was passed and women were given the right to vote. During this crucial time of change for women's rights, there was an increased importance placed upon female authors, such as Kate Chopin. They often use their stories to call out injustices and inequalities between men and women. And Kate Chopin does just this in her short story, The Story of an Hour. So, my thesis was while Chopin's story is thought provoking and inspiring all on its own, understanding the historical context of the story as well as Kate Chopin's personal life and writing tactics allow the reader to glean much more from this outstanding short story. So, the first thing I'd like to look at is the legal history of women's rights and marriage in particular. So, Ellen Dannon's article entitled Marriage and Law Reform Lessons from the 19th Century Michigan Married Women's Property Acts discusses the history of women's legal rights in Michigan. It specifically looks at something called coverture, which is the idea that once a woman got married, um, her and her husband, the two become one flesh, and because of that, the legal ramifications were that all of what was the woman's coming into the marriage became the husband's. So when Louise Mallard's husband dies in Kate Chopin's short story, the idea is that all of her things that went to her husband at the time of their marriage were now no longer her husband's and went back to her. So in a sense, she was getting her property back and getting her freedom back from that marriage. The next thing I'd like to discuss is the new inventions. Ryan Evans' article, The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin, discusses the short story in various contexts. Specifically, it also looks at the changing times that Kate Chopin was writing in. She was she was writing in the same setting that she was alive. So at both the time she was alive and the time that the story takes place, some new inventions were coming onto the scene because it was around the time of the Industrial Revolution. So specifically, we're looking at the railroad and the telegraph. And these are important not only in the time that Chopin is living and writing, but also within the story because Brentley Mallard is supposedly killed in a railroad accident. And the way that they know that he has been killed is because Richards receives a telegraph outlining his death. So another thing that was changing, obviously, in this time were women's rights. So I think that something that Chopin was kind of pointing to was we're living in changing times. There are new inventions. We can cross the country in considerably shorter times. We can talk to far off relatives in considerably shorter times. We don't have to write letters anymore. So women's rights should be changing too. So female authors like Kate Chopin are kind of drawing these ties and saying, we're living in changing times, technology's changing, times are changing, women's rights should be changing. And so they're implementing feminism and pushing feminism through their writing to kind of get that point across. So the next thing I'd like to discuss is religion. Going back to Ryan Evans' article, he also talks about how Chopin does not mention religion within her story. Now, this could again go back to the time that she's writing in, because she's living in the time that she's writing. Darwinism was more coming onto the scene. We were, as a society was kind of shifting, they were going more towards Darwinism and science over religion and the church. And so this is evident in Chopin's own life. She was raised Catholic, but she was very interested in Darwinism. So because of this, there's no mention of religion in her story. That said, kind of going with that theme of Darwinism, she does talk about nature a lot. She calls Louise Mallard, compares her to a goddess of victory, and she also uses terms that are very much spring related, blue skies, that sort of thing, to point to this new chapter in Louise Mallard's life. So she's kind of saying that this death of Louise Mallard's husband, Brentley, is a spring, it's a new dawn for Louise Mallard's freedom. The next thing I'd like to discuss is language. Stephen Doleff's article, Kate Chopin's Lexical Diagnostic in the Story of an Hour, discusses this. He specifically talks about Louise Mallard's name. Her name does not come up until the 17th of 23 paragraphs. So this is a short story, obviously, and over halfway through, her name is finally mentioned. She's no longer called Mrs. Mallard. She's no longer only denoted as Brentley Mallard's wife. She's actually named. And this could be because she's stepping into that freedom that she thinks she has. Her husband's dead. She is no longer under that coveture that I discussed earlier. Her things are her own. Her freedom is her own. She has a name now. She has an identity, and it's her own. Also, Louise Mallard's name, the etymology of it, could point to that illness of her heart. So it could have been almost like a foreshadowing just in her name as well. And then, along with language, I'd like to discuss language ambiguity. So, Gary Mayer's article, A Matter of Behavior, a Semantic Analysis of Five Kate Chopin Stories, he discusses the semantics present in a lot of Kate Chopin stories. Specifically, I'm obviously looking at the story of an hour, but he defines general semantics as how language, thought, and action are interrelated. Um, he specifically discusses the danger of assumption. So every character in this story assumes something, all starting with the fact that they assume that Brentley Mallard is dead. Richards assumes that the telegraph is correct, that it's relaying accurate information. Josephine assumes that Louise Mallard is upset that her husband's dead and that she's not happy. There's a ton of misunderstanding and assumptions going on throughout the story. And if those assumptions hadn't been present, if those semantics hadn't been present, um, it's likely that the story definitely wouldn't have ended the way that it did. Without assuming so much, there wouldn't have been so much emotional tension and ramping up, and Louise Mallard wouldn't have gotten so happy that she experienced a joy that kills, as the text states. And in fact, if people hadn't assumed anything, there might not have been a story to tell, because that story of an hour wouldn't have unfolded in the way that it did. So the last thing I'd like to discuss is the personal life of Kate Chopin. Again, I'm going back to Ryan Evans' article. He discusses how Kate Chopin's personal life somewhat mirrors Louise Mallard's life in some ways. So the first thing he points out is that Chopin's father was actually killed in a railroad accident. So as I mentioned, Kate Chopin is writing her story in the same time period that she's currently living. So with the railroad coming into play in her own personal reality, she's also pulling it into her story. And Chopin's own father was killed in a railroad accident. Unfortunately, it wasn't a miscommunication or an unfortunate telegraph. He had actually passed from a railroad accident. The other similarity between Kate Chopin's life and that of Louise Mallard was her marriage. She was married to Oscar Chopin. However, he died considerably young, and she was kind of given that independence that Louise Mallard got a taste of. That said, it's interesting to note that there's nothing that points to Kate Chopin being specifically unhappy with Oscar. She seems to be calling out marriage and all of the legalities and legalistics that go into marriage and go into kind of confining a woman in that social constraint. Most literature points to the idea that her and Oscar were on good terms, that they liked each other. And similarly, the text points out that Brentley Mallard was never really awful or anything to Louise Mallard. It just was the social institution of marriage that was the problem throughout the story. So overall, I think that by looking at the historical context, including the legal issues and the changing times that Chopin is writing in and under, as well as looking at her emphasis on nature over religion and the ambiguity she uses in her language, including etymology and semantics, as well as the parallels to Kate Chopin's personal life, really adds a lot to this text. It's incredible on its own, but seeing kind of how all of these different aspects that are going on at the same time contribute to the text and contribute to the richness of Kate Chopin's points in writing are very important. And here's my works cited. Thank you for watching.